continuing in the book of Mark this evening. We'll be in Mark chapter 2 and hopefully getting into Mark chapter 3. Before we get started with Mark, let's start with a word of prayer. Lawrence, would you mind saying that prayer for us?
Our Almighty Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the time that we have to gather here tonight and to offer our worship unto you and study more about your will for us. And we pray that we'll all be attentive to the teachers and what they say. We pray we'll contemplate on the words that are said and taught and make any applications in our lives so we can be strengthened. We thank you so much for all the blessings that we enjoy. We pray you'll be at those of our number who are not able to be here tonight, whether they're traveling or sick. Watch over them and bring them back to us. We pray that you'll be at the teachers tonight, that they'll have a ready remembrance of things they have prepared and present them in a way that is most beneficial. We thank you again for all the blessings we enjoy in this life, and we especially thank you for Christ and the sacrifice that he made on our behalf. It's in his name we pray. Amen.
So in Mark 1 and Mark 2, we began with the ministry of Jesus. We've been emphasizing, especially in these first few chapters, the authority of Jesus. We see that when he first started teaching, they were amazed that he taught as one having authority. We see he shows that he is from God, that he is the Son of God through the miracles that he is performing. We look in chapter 1, he was able to cast out a demon, an unclean spirit from a man. He has authority over the demons and power over the demons. He heals a man with leprosy. He has power over diseases. We see his authority there. We also saw his compassion that he had in healing that man with leprosy, willing to touch this man with leprosy so that he would be healed. And in all of this, though, we see his main purpose is emphasized in Mark 1 and verse 38. When the crowds were gathering all around him, he sought to go to other cities that he may preach, for that is what I came for. And we see that in every instance. Jesus would go to the synagogues and he would begin preaching. And that preaching and teaching that he did it stood out in contrast to the scribes and the Pharisees. While they focused on their rabbinical interpretations and traditions, Jesus focused on the Old Covenant and the truth. And he would turn back to the Scriptures. And he taught with authority from the Scriptures. We see that in the Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to see that here at the end of Matthew 2 and at the end of Mark 2 and beginning in Mark 3. But we ended last week talking about this paralytic who was let down from the roof by his friends because they could not get to Jesus because the crowds were so great that they could not enter into the house where Jesus was at. And so what they do is they dig through the mortar and the dirt and all that is there to get to the tiles of the roof. Then they remove the tiles from the roof to lay their friend, this paralytic, down at the feet of Jesus. And Jesus, seeing this, what does he say? First of all, what does it say he sees? He sees their faith. Faith is something that is seen. He sees their efforts. He sees their work as an expression of their faith. And as they lay this man down, Jesus could have said anything here at this time. But what does Jesus say after he sees their faith? What is the response of Jesus?
Son, your sins are forgiven.
Yeah, interesting response after all that has happened and after all that Jesus could say here. Again, he's putting the spiritual over the physical. We see just another example of that. And he says his sins are forgiven him. And the scribes hear this. They are in the crowd. They are thinking in their hearts, and Jesus is able to know what they are thinking. And what are the scribes thinking? Yeah, and is that wrong in and of itself? Is that thought wrong?
No, they were correct.
They're right, right? In that first part, they're right in the conclusion that only God can forgive sins, but what they are unwilling to see and have been unwilling to see so far is that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus is deity. And they would be right in saying that it would be blasphemy, right? If a man says he can forgive sins, that would be blasphemy if he is not, if it were not the Son of God. If Jesus is not God, that would be blasphemous to say. But Jesus is aware of this, it says, proving, again, that little detail, proving that Jesus is God. He knows what they are thinking in their hearts, and He knows they're just not searching for the truth. That's not their heart. He knows their heart. They're searching for a reason to accuse Jesus and to attack Jesus, and that's why He knows their reasoning. It says there in 8, and He asks them, "Why are you reasoning about these things in your heart?" And then what does Jesus do? What does Jesus do to prove He has this power? He has this authority.
Tells them your sins are or which is easier, your sins are forgiven or arise, take up your bed and walk. Of course, He told them to arise, take your bed and go to your house.
Yeah, he's going to prove that He is the Son of Man who has this authority and has this power. And like I said, Matthew 9 and verse 4, he refers to their thinking as evil. So yes, their conclusion is correct, by the way, but as we know with the hearts of the scribes and the Pharisees, as we're going to see as we continue in Mark chapter 2, their hearts were hardened, Jesus would describe. He knows they're thinking this just to try to trap Him. They're not really trying to have this discussion and understand the truth, are they? They don't want to understand who Jesus really is. That's why He calls their thinking evil in Matthew's account in Matthew 9. And so He poses that question to them. Which is easier to do? To say to this man, his sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and pick up your pallet and walk? And then He goes on in verse 10. He says, but so that you know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, He said to the paralytic, I say to you, get up, pick up your pallet and go home. And he got up immediately and picked up the pallet and went out in the sight of everyone, so that they were all amazed and were glorifying God, saying, we have never seen anything like this. So again, we get to the purpose of miracles here again, just reinforcing the miracles weren't to put on a show. They weren't to be sensationalistic. They were to prove the claim that Jesus made, that He is the Son of Man, that He is the Son of God, and that He has the authority to forgive sins. It proves who He is. He's saying to these scribes and these Pharisees, I can show you that I have the right to say that this man's sins are forgiven because I will heal him. If He were doing anything that was evil, if He was doing anything that was sinful, God would not bless him. God would not be with him. So here is one instance in the book of Mark when we talk about, a lot of modern scholars like to point to the book of Mark and say that Jesus Himself never makes the claim to be deity, never makes the claim to be God. I think we see it here in Mark chapter 2 in His actions and what He's saying and what He's inferring. That yes, He is the Son of God, that yes, He is God because He has the power to forgive sins, that He has that authority. And what did we say? When you think of that phrase, the Son of Man, we've talked about it a little bit before, but what is always a good reference to go to when you hear that phrase, the Son of Man? What Old Testament book uses that same phrase? Give you a hint, it's one we're studying right now. Daniel chapter 7. They always associate that phrase, the Son of Man, with Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14. Because what does that tell us about the Son of Man? It says there that the Son of Man was one who was given dominion He was given glory, and he's given a kingdom. Back to this idea of authority. This Son of Man, yes, while it connects to his humanity, it also, I think, emphasizes that he is from God, that he is deity, that he has the right, and that he has the authority to forgive sins on earth. You know, anybody can make that claim, right? Jesus can make the claim, and then he can back up the claim through his actions. And we see this authority that was given to Jesus. You can turn to John 5:25 through 27, and Matthew 9, and in verse 8. We'll look at the example of John, but God the Father gave his Son the authority to execute judgment as the Son of Man while he was here on earth. John 5, verse 25, "Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and now is when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For just as the Father has life in himself, even so he gave to the Son also to have life in himself. And he gave him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man." Christ has this authority. This authority has been given to him through the Father. He has life, and he has the authority to execute that judgment because he is, as Daniel prophesied about, he is that Son of Man who was given this dominion and this glory and this kingdom. Just like a little syllogism here talking about this, making this claim that Jesus is God. How can we know it? We can know it from the book of Mark. If we just follow that story, right? Only God can forgive sins. Jesus claims to be able to forgive sins. And Jesus performs a miracle that demonstrates that demonstrates God approves of his claim. We also know Jesus is sinless. And putting all those things together, therefore, we can know that Jesus is the Son of God. Any other comments on this story of the paralytic before we move to these confrontations that he has, these further confrontations? If not, let's read. Eric, if you'll read verses 14 through 17 of Mark 2.
As he passed by, he saw Levi the son of Alphaeus sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." So he arose and followed him. Now it happened as he was dining in Levi's house that many tax collectors and sinners also sat together with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many, and they followed him. And when the scribes and Pharisees saw him eating with the tax collectors and sinners, they said to his disciples, "How is it that he eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance."
So here Jesus calls another disciple to him, Levi or Matthew, to follow after him. And this is interesting because of who Matthew is, right? Matthew is a tax collector. And how did the Jews view the tax collectors? And why did they view them this way? What did the Jews think about tax collectors?
They hate them.
Yeah. And it's just more than them just being a tax collector. Most people don't like tax collectors, I guess. But it's what are some reasons that they dislike these tax collectors? Hate's probably the better word. They truly look down on these men, and why is that?
Collected more than they should have at times, kept the rest for themselves.
That's definitely part of it. A lot of them were known to be nefarious and not honest in their dealings, and they would extract more from the people than they should have. They thought they were men without any integrity. They had a reputation of being deceitful. So that's definitely one reason. What's the other reason?
They were Jews working for the Roman government.
Yeah, who are they collecting? Yeah, who are they collecting taxes on behalf of? They're collecting taxes on behalf of Rome. And how did the Jews view Rome? Right, they were subjugated to Rome. Rome were the conquerors. They did not have a high view of the Roman authority. So you got these men, you got your own brethren, right? Your own Jewish brethren who are collecting taxes on behalf of who you view as really an enemy. and they're collecting taxes for them. And then on top of that, like Lawrence said, they were oftentimes deceitful. So they viewed them really in a very low way. They looked down on these men. They lumped them in together, obviously, with other sinners. And yet, Jesus calls this man Matthew to get up and follow him. Matthew might of himself been surprised that Jesus would call him to follow after him. And then as the story goes on, he dines at the house of Matthew. And what are the Pharisees and scribes? What is their reaction to Jesus eating at the house of Matthew?
They're suspicious because he's eating with tax collectors.
Yeah, they didn't think with their view of them, they didn't think you should really associate with them in this manner. They found it suspicious that he would even eat with and drink with these tax collectors and sinners. They thought that might lump Jesus in with them and their cohorts. And what is Jesus' response to their question? What does Jesus say? He really describes his mission. What was the mission of Jesus? Yeah, the great physician, that song, we get it from this verse, right? He says, it is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus gets to his purpose. Jesus' mission on earth was to bring sinners to repentance. That is why he came. You know, there's a very similar situation in Luke 15, a chapter we might be familiar with, where there's a Pharisee he says something similar because he's sitting with them. He says, this man receives sinners and he eats with them. And if you remember Luke 15, Jesus uses that opportunity, and what does he teach? What lesson does he teach there? That records 3 of Jesus' parables there in Luke 15. After this Pharisee said he sits with these sinners and he eats with them. What 3 parables does Jesus launch into right after that? Yeah, again, emphasizing, why did Jesus come? It's to bring the lost to salvation, the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost brother, the prodigal son. Very similar context to Mark chapter 2. I want to look at that verse 17. When he's talking to the Pharisees, he says, it's not those who are healthy who need a physician. He says, I didn't come to call the righteous. He's not saying what about the Jewish leaders there? He's not saying that the Jewish leaders are what? Yeah. He's speaking to the Jewish leaders, I believe, how they would have viewed themselves, right? They think they're righteous. They think they are healthy. They think they do not need a physician. He's not saying this is who you are, but this is who you think you are. In fact, in Luke 15, who would the Jewish leadership represent in that last parable of the prodigal son?
The elder brother.
Yeah, they represent that elder brother. He's just pointing out to them again, they're blind in how they see themselves. They're blind in how they recognize their situation. They think they're healthy. They think they're righteous. But it is just the opposite. Another story along those lines, really this is what Jesus is trying to teach them all throughout, but John 9, remember when he heals the blind man in John 9? What does the Jewish leadership try to do with that blind man? They ask him all these questions, trying to get him to say what? Or trying to get him to deny Christ, right? They're trying to find a way. They try to make sure that he's been blind from birth. They're trying to say that what he is saying is false. They're not believing that Jesus healed this man of his blindness, and the blind man keeps reiterating, I know what happened. I was blind and now I can see, and it was Jesus who did this. And in that story, he's pointing out, he's contrasting. It's the Jewish leadership who is actually blind. Because they can't see from this miracle that Jesus is the Son of God. Here in Mark 2, it's the exact same thing. They can't see the purpose and the mission of Jesus. Jesus teaching in parables, it's the same mission. Why did he say he taught in parables in Mark 4 and in Matthew 13? He goes back and he quotes from Isaiah, and what does he say? He teaches in parables because who will understand?
Those who want to understand.
Yeah, he says those who desire to understand, they will, but there will be those who have eyes but they do not see, right? They have ears but they do not hear. Again, that's describing the Jewish leadership. The parables aren't difficult to understand, but when you come in with a hardened heart, already desiring to reject Jesus because of his fame and his popularity as it is growing, and as men and women are turning to him, their heart becomes even more hard, that they are essentially blind. They're not actually healthy. They're not actually, righteous, but they do need a physician, but they're not willing to go to the physician. So that's why Jesus, I believe, says what he says. He goes to this group who he describes that are sick because they know that they are sick, right? They know that they need help. They know that they need forgiveness. Jesus has come to save those. He's come to save those who know that they need their sins forgiven. The Pharisees do not see this. They believe they are righteous. They believe they are God's people, but they cannot see the actual truth. There's a lesson for us today there also. In order for us to be called to the Lord and to follow the Lord, we have to recognize who we really are, right? We have to recognize that we have lived in sin, that we are sinners, that we need forgiveness, and that it is only through Christ that we can have forgiveness. The story of the rich young ruler is very similar to that, isn't it? He thought he was righteous. He didn't know that he needed to leave all to follow Christ. He didn't recognize the actual state that he was in. And moving on from there, unless anybody else has anything on the story of Matthew being called to follow him, we get to the story of fasting. Just another example of the Pharisees looking for anything to accuse Jesus of. In verses 18 through 22. Verses 18 through 22. Let's go ahead and read there. It says, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and they came to him and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "While the bridegroom is with them, the attendants of the bridegroom cannot fast, can they? So long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, otherwise the patch pulls away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear results. No one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins." So they come to him again, and what is their question this time? What are they questioning Jesus about?
Fasting of the disciples of John and the Pharisees.
He said, John's disciples, Luke 5 and verse 33, it appears that they fasted often. The Pharisees also fasted often. I think the Pharisees may have been doing it for a different reason, to be seen by men. That's how they fasted. They made their appearance look like they were fasting so others could see that they were fasting. And so they question, if we fast so much and John's disciples fasted so much, why aren't your disciples fasting? And when you go to the old law, what was the requirement for fasting? When were they to fast?
Day of Atonement.
on the Day of Atonement. Leviticus 16, verses 29 through 31. And I also put up there, it had become a practice by the Pharisees. According to their traditions, they would fast twice a week. They would fast on, I believe it was Mondays and Thursdays, from what I can read. They would fast on those days. And when we think about fasting, what is fasting usually associated with? Why would people usually fast?
Associated with prayer, because they were going to God for some reason or other.
Prayer would definitely be a part of it, and it was also usually they were. What was the condition of their mind or their heart? They were usually what? Think about all the times people fasted. Why were they fasting in the Old Testament?
There was sorrow involved, atonement.
Yeah, they were. When you look at, it's usually sometimes associated with sin. That the people were mourning. The people were extremely sorrowful, right? That was what was associated with fasting. And so that gets into the point that Jesus makes here, right, about the bridegroom and the attendance of the bridegroom. He uses these three metaphors. And what is meant by that first metaphor about the wedding feast and the bridegroom? What is Jesus saying there in verses 19 and 20 of why his disciples are not fasting at this time?
Basically because Jesus is still with them.
Yeah, Jesus is with them. The Messiah is there. You know this language about a wedding feast, the bridegroom, the new wine, the new clothing. That banqueting type of language, that wedding feast type of language, it's used in prophecies in Isaiah to describe the new kingdom, to describe that kingdom that was coming. And now the Messiah is here. It says the bridegroom is with them, right? Christ is with them. It's not a time to be sorrowful, is it? It's a time of rejoicing. Jesus has come. He's come to give forgiveness. The Son of Man is here, so it's not a time for them to be fasting while Jesus is with them. He says what's going to happen, though. When Jesus is taken away, what will happen? Then they will fast on that day. That will be a time of sorrow and a time of mourning for them. And then he uses two other metaphors about putting a new cloth on an old garment, and how that happens. The new cloth is usually stronger, right? And after a few washings, the tear would actually be even worse than was at the beginning. Same thing with the new wine and the old wine. Basically, the idea we're moving on to the new. We're moving past the old and we're coming into the new. Even the days of John's disciples and the Pharisees, we're moving past those things. We're not looking backwards, but we're heading towards this new kingdom that Christ is coming in. And in all of this, he's emphasizing his disciples, they have not violated the law in any way. What have they violated?
Tradition.
Yeah, they have violated the Pharisees' traditions and their extra expectations that they added to the law. They violated those things, but those things didn't have really anything to do with the law that God had given to them. And that's going to continue in this next story as we continue. Because what happens next, verses 23 through 28. Lawrence, if you'll read verses 23 through 28 as we get to the Sabbath.
Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" But he said to them, "Have you ever read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priest, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath."
So we're going to see two stories here back to back about the Sabbath day. And why do they even bring up the Sabbath really here in verse 23. Why do these scribes and Pharisees bring it up? It's just another attempt to try to ensnare Jesus. They're emphasizing their traditions, they're emphasizing their interpretations of the Sabbath. But Jesus, as he concludes there in verse 28, Jesus knows about the Sabbath and the law of the Sabbath. Why? What does he conclude there in verse 28? Yeah, he's the one who has given the commandment. He knows what the Sabbath is and what the Sabbath is about, because he is the Lord. He is the one who gave the commandment to follow the Sabbath. And so it's important when we look at all these confrontations, there's the difference between what the Old Covenant actually teaches and what their rabbis and their traditions and their interpretations taught. We saw that begin with the Sermon on the Mount, and we see it with the fasting. We're going to see it with the questions about the Sabbath. I bring up the Mishnah again. I brought it up last week, but it is a compilation of all Jewish traditions. And one part of the Mishnah, it lists 39 work activities that they had forbidden on the Sabbath. And according to their Mishnah, they probably would have been accusing them of violating activities number 3 and number 5 from that list that they had. They would be accusing them. Number 3 was reaping, and number 5 was threshing. Which, from what I've read and what I've seen, that wasn't even really the mainstream rabbinical interpretation at the time. They were using an extreme, view of the Sabbath simply to try to trap Jesus and accuse Jesus and his disciples. But none of this was actually God's law at all. It just shows their desperation to attack Jesus and find anything on Jesus that they could try to accuse him of, because they were becoming envious and they were becoming jealous of Jesus. And we're going to see it in chapter 3 after that second story about the Sabbath. They go away and they want to destroy him. They're upset about Jesus and what he is teaching. And so what example then does Jesus use to teach them about the Sabbath? Who does he go to? David. Yeah, exactly right. 1 Samuel 21 is where that story is. And if you look there, it says the high priest is Elimelech at that time. Abiathar is the son of Elimelech. So it might be when he says Abiathar here in Mark 2, it might be just referring to the days of Abiathar, that Abiathar was soon to be the high priest. It was during his lifetime. He was just not the high priest yet. And what did Jesus know about the Pharisees and what they would say about David and the priest in this story? They weren't going to do what? They weren't going to condemn David, were they? They weren't going to condemn David or the priest and their actions on that day. And yet, at the same time, pointing out their inconsistency, they would condemn Jesus and his disciples. To be consistent, they could not have it both ways. And yet they were trying to do just that, trying to have it both ways. And so he reveals their inconsistency. He reveals their hypocrisy. He reveals how they are unreasonable, that they don't always apply this law in the same way. He's going to expose it even more when he heals the man with the withered hand, right? What does he say they would do on the Sabbath? Just jumping ahead here, though, talking about their hypocrisy. He says, what would they do on the Sabbath?
Pull their sheep out of the pit.
Yeah, they'd pull a sheep that needed help out of the pit. They'd pull an oxen that needed help out of the pit. And yet at the same time, they try to condemn Jesus for healing a man's hand on the Sabbath. He is Jesus, the master teacher, showing them their hypocrisy, showing how inconsistent they are. And the crowd around can see this in their teaching, and they can see there's something different about Jesus and what he is teaching here. So thinking about this story then that he uses, he goes to the story of David. And he gives the example of David and his men who were hungry and needed food. And they went to the high priest and they received food from the high priest. And he just brings up this story, I believe, to show that the Pharisees, you miss the whole point of the Sabbath. If the Pharisees could defend why David was innocent before God, if they could make that argument, right, which I'm sure they have, then they could, their argument against Christ and against his disciples completely flies out the window. In Matthew's account in chapter 12 is interesting because Jesus quotes from Hosea 6 and verse 6 there to, I believe, justify David. You can have two different views on, was David right in what he did here, or was David wrong in what he did on that day? I've seen it argued from two different perspectives. But I think Hosea 6 and verse 6, Jesus quoting from that and applying it to that situation, I think would imply there that even David in that example did not do anything wrong. Because in Matthew 12 and verse 7, what does Jesus say there as he applies it to this situation? That God desires what?
Mercy, not sacrifice.
He says, I desire mercy. I desire compassion and not a sacrifice. You would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus here talking about a man's need or his hunger can be satisfied by doing what the disciples did, by grinding the grain in one's hands on the Sabbath day and then eating from that grain. They could do that without any guilt being associated with them. That was not wrong to do. It was only wrong according to your traditions. Jesus is speaking, Truth Commentary talks about this. He says Jesus speaks only of the legal rituals of Judaism, not of the moral and ethical principles that by inclusion in the New Testament are seen to be eternally inviolable. So what the Pharisees are trying to do, they're trying to fence the law. They're trying to make these men guilty by fencing the law, by making regulations that were not necessary in the commandment of God. And Jesus again proves he is the master teacher, proves he has authority. He goes back to the old law and he teaches them from the old law. And he teaches obviously as one who gave the commandment in the first place. And that brings us to the next story in chapter 3 as we continue. We already started it, but it speaks to this man with the withered hand. And I like just how it phrases it there with the Pharisees. What are the Pharisees doing when Jesus comes into the synagogue? What are they doing?
Watching him closely.
They're watching him closely. And why? You wouldn't think that probably wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, right? Jesus watched him closely. But why are they watching him closely?
To accuse him of sin.
Yeah, they're not doing it out of pure motives. They're not doing it to learn from Jesus. They're watching him with a closely, right, judgmental type of mindset that if he does anything wrong, we're going to be able to pounce. And they believe they have the opportunity, right? They see this man with this withered hand. They know Jesus is going to heal this man, and so they're looking for the opportunity. They believe that they have Jesus in a trap when he heals this man here. But again, this goes back to their traditions. And what is the question that Jesus asked them? This man is here with a withered hand. Jesus looks directly at these scribes and these Pharisees, and what does he ask?
Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or evil, to save life or to kill?
Yeah, verse 4. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? What's their response?
Silence.
Yeah, why are they silent? Because they know either answer they give puts them in a bad spot, right? They know they can't give an answer because in the other accounts, in Luke's account, we mentioned it, he references the pulling the ox out of the ditch, pulling the sheep out of the ditch. They do good for animals on the Sabbath when it is to their benefit. So they do good on the Sabbath, and so they can't answer that it wouldn't be lawful to do good because they do those things on the Sabbath themselves. So they're in a difficult situation. Here, this is a human. This isn't an animal. This is a human who is suffering with a withered hand. So they can't answer the question. And after they do not answer the question, what's Jesus' response? It's interesting. Before he heals, what is Jesus' mind? It's one of the few times we see he's what? Angry. He's angry. Why is he angry? Yeah, because just what we talked about, right? They know the answer, right? There's no doubt they know the answer, but their hearts are so hardened that they're going to stand there in silence. You see that also in Luke chapter 14. He heals a man with dropsy on the Sabbath, and it's the same. He poses that question to them again. Basically, why is it okay to pull an ox out of the ditch but not to heal? And the Pharisees have no response for him there again, exposing their hypocrisy, exposing their interpretations of the law to be false. And then there's something else I think very interesting about that question as you continue the story, because verse 6 tells us what about the Pharisees and the Herodians. They're so upset that what are they now planning? So you put all these things together, verses 4 to verse 6. The Pharisees, the Herodians, they're so upset about Jesus and his teachings that they seek to kill him, that they seek to destroy him. And it's just an amazing contrast, right? Because what do you have Jesus doing? Here and as we began his ministry, what is Jesus doing? He's healing, he's restoring, he's giving life. He's showing he has the power to give life, the power to restore. And then you have these Pharisees on the other hand, whose hearts are so hardened that they're seeking to kill. They're seeking to destroy. They're so blind about their situation that they can't see the truth that is in front of them. You have this one who is all about restoration and all about giving life. And at the same time, they're plotting how they can kill and how they can destroy his life. Yes, he had a right to have this righteous anger because he knows their thinking, he knows the condition of their heart, he knows the sad situation that they are in. Also, these men are supposed to be what? They're the men that everyone would come to learn about the law. And they have so twisted it and they have so perverted it that Jesus is having to undo all of that in his teaching and in his ministry. You know, it's just amazing to think about and everything that they are doing. They're watching them closely. They bring up the Sabbath, not because they're concerned about God's law. Their hearts are so hard that they're not concerned about finding out what the truth is, but just to trap him and just to try to destroy him.
Tyler, verse 4, it said, to save life or kill, he's saving life. And one of them, they're killing. He just asked him that question. They knew the answer.
It's fascinating. It's right after that. That's why that's so fascinating, that contrast. He asks him that question, and then immediately they think, how can we kill Jesus? It's amazing. And that's the danger, though, when we talk about hardness of hearts. That's the danger. When you start to let your heart become seared a little bit, you can find yourself going down that path. That's why we're always amazed at Pharaoh. How could he keep allowing that to happen? His heart grew hard, and he allowed all that death to happen. We have to be on warning against that. Thank you for your attention this evening. We'll begin there.